I'm the first speaker, so I set the tone. So no pressure on me to set a reasonable tone for you. In acknowledging the traditional owners, I'd like to also acknowledge their connection to country and the care in which they do look after country. I'm lucky I do work with Spinifex mob out at Great Victoria Desert, as well as some of the Noongar people in the southwest as well. So I'm lucky in that regard, and I recognise the work they do in that respect. So what I'm going to talk about really is where we're headed for the EIA in 2024, and I don't know what your backgrounds are, so some of you are going to fall asleep because it's all old hat to you. The rest of you, particularly the young ones, you may find this interesting. Hopefully we do. We'll see how we go. So I'm going to talk about the most recent changes in EIA, which you may have missed, came through about 12 months ago. Paul Vogle's reforms, what he proposes for EPAT, and what are the likely changes the government will accept for that. We need to talk about nature positive, what's happening out with the Commonwealth, and what it all means for you guys. Offsets, the I word. We can't avoid it, and it's going to get bigger and bigger, offsets. And also things to watch. So things that I have observed and the likely things that could happen in the future for us. So some things you may have missed. Look, with impact assessment, EPA, as you know, advises the minister and the minister decides on proposals. Before ULURI, what used to happen was that the outcome of appeal, so when anyone appeals a EPA report, the minister decides on those appeals, what was the practice, and it was kind of not quite clear in the legislation, what was the practice was that the appeal outcome matched the minister's decision. For example, if the minister upheld an appeal and found something to be environmentally unacceptable, generally speaking, that was what happened. If the minister upheld appeals and had said additional conditions be put, that was what happened. ULURI changed that. Now, ULURI, as you probably know, is a uranium mine. That's the location there. EPA assessment found it to be environmentally unacceptable, primarily because of subterranean fauna, which were present on the site, and they were only found on that site and only in the pit site as well, which means if the proposal was to go ahead, there's a high likelihood of extinction of those species. And that's why the EPA found it to be unacceptable. So what did the minister do on appeal? Now, the proponent clearly was not happy with the EPA report. The proponent appealed that report. What the minister dismissed the appeal. The first cart in the beer goes this man here. What happens is that the minister dismissed the appeal, which means he found it to be environmentally unacceptable. You would have thought that's the end of the story. However, through the 45 process, that's the process under the Act where the minister actually consults with DMAs or decision-making authorities, primarily ministers, to come up with the final approval or not. He found that it actually would be approved, despite the fact he upheld the appeals and found the proposal to be environmentally unacceptable. That changed the rules for impact assessment. The Supreme Court upheld that decision and found the minister acted accordingly. There's a slight catch with that, and which I will get to in a tick. So the minister consults with fellow ministers. Now, the trick is, in consulting with fellow ministers, they have to be decision-making ministers, not just anyone. And therefore, they must find it acceptable, taking into account the powers of those ministers that he consults with. And in this case, the Minister for Mining was a DMA, and they found that to be acceptable. And so it's a bit of a catch on that one there, but that changes the rules. And we will see that play out with other proposals as well. It'll still primarily be the same, but there will be those exceptions where the minister will disagree with the EPA, not through the appeals process, but through the decision-making process. So there's that now separation. You may be aware that when a proposal gets referred to the EPA must make a decision on significance. Should it have a significant impact? If so, it will formally assess it. There's now a provision in the Act which says that if there, for example, is a single factor which might be significant, the EPA cannot assess it and leave it to that other decision-making authority to deal with that. It's primarily to deal with Part 5 clearing. So Part 5 clearing, now, if the only the only environmental issue that your mine has is just clearing of vegetation. That's it. You're almost certain to not to get an EPA assessment, but it gets deferred to Part 5 clearing. And there's an interesting catch in that, if you know the two parts of the process. The EPA process is confined by the definition of environment in the Act, and it can only make advice based on the environmental impacts of that proposal. However, under Part 5 clearing, the CEO can find a proposal to be a significant variance to the clearing principles. However, under 51.0, can still approve it based on the fact that of planning matters, public benefit as well. So, but the EPA can't do that. So under Part 5, you're more likely to get an approval if your proposal is environmentally unacceptable, given that clause of the Act. So in that case, no decisions by... so the other one is that if you go through a formal assessment and you get a series of impacts at the end, EPA would normally set a condition on each of those. If the EPA finds that a particular impact can be managed by someone else, it will not set a condition on that. And you'll see in particular Part 5 clearing, but also mine closures. Now, EPA will not set a condition on mine closures because DEMERS can deal with that. So that will be that's been quite a change as well. And Part 5 works with approval and licensing as well. So anything to do with emissions, the EPA and the Minister are unlikely to set a condition if Part 5 can deal with it. So that's been quite a change in that regard. Planning schemes, I'll quickly go through because not a lot of planners here. Previously, and this may be of more relevance to those who work on the Swan Coastal Plain in the metropolitan area, that sometimes the planning schemes get in the way of things. Previously, all planning schemes had to refer to the EPA. There was no significance bar in that regard. When you look at 201 schemes that were assessed by the EPA, can you see 150 of those, 75% of those were not assessed by the EPA. So what's the point of referring to that? So what's happened now is regulations have come in, which now require that only prescribed, prescribed scheme amendments are ones that you don't have to refer. So local governments now cannot refer certain schemes to the EPA. So that's been changed in that regard. Okay, I'm just conscious I can talk forever, but the Bogle proposed reforms. Okay, let's go through the ones which probably have most significance for you guys in that regard. He suggested updating the admin procedures to put a stronger focus on pre-referral. And I think we'll see this change come in, that you've got to work with the officers of the EPA Services Unit to have a look at your proposal to try and mitigate your impacts before referral. So there's going to be a change of emphasis about doing a lot more work pre-referral in that regard. This is an interesting one, which I think there's problems with this. He's saying there should be a statement of intent for the EPA, which is if the government of the day has a particular policy, for example, critical minerals, that one there, promoting that, Bogle's suggesting the EPA should take that into account. I've got to tell you that that's going to be difficult for the EPA because it's already been burned a few times in taking into account social economic factors in dealing with assessments. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to push all this towards the minister part of the decision making. I don't think the EPA can be constrained in that regard for that. A change to the EPA, up until about 6 months ago, there was no one on the EPA who had an environmental science degree, either lawyers, a geographer, and there are a couple of people from the social impact assessment side of things. This is to say they should be experts in their field. A risk-based approach to assessment proposals, so that those low-risk ones can go through much more quickly. So changing some of the levels of assessment so that those low-risk ones go through quickly. He's suggesting to reduce the scope of social surroundings. If you know, the definition of environment in the Act says, refers to not just biophysical, but social surroundings. So EPA has to take into account social surroundings. What does that mean? Social surroundings means there must be a connection between the biophysical and the human. The obvious one, for example, would be Aboriginal heritage. A lot of Aboriginal heritage is actually connected to country and also the environment, whether it be a watercourse, a wetland, a rocky outcrop. So there's a clear connection between the biophysical and the social. It's not just Aboriginal, by the way, but that's probably the most important example. Now, what the hope was that the EPA would get out of Aboriginal heritage. I'm going to tell you they're not going to, okay? Because here's the kicker for EPA. The Aboriginal Heritage Act specifically talks about direct impacts, about whether you can actually disturb a site. It doesn't deal with indirect impacts. EPA, therefore, has to deal with indirect impacts. For example, air quality, and therefore indirect impacts on air quality. Water quality, and impacts on water quality, which impacts on the cultural significance of an Aboriginal site. So the EPA is locked into that. I can't see that changing, and so despite what the government may think about that. So that's the example of one. Appeals, he's recommending that all Part 5 appeals go to SAT. So that's on clearing and works approval. If that's the case, the only people can appeal would be you as a proponent. There'll be no third-party appeals. I'm not sure where that's going. My sense is maybe, I think it's 50-50 that will happen. The case. This one is unlikely. Bogle recommended removal of all Part 4 appeals. What I think may happen is removal of appeal on level of assessment, but appeals on EPA reports is likely to stay. And I say that for two reasons. One is 75% of appeals on EPA reports are upheld. What that tells you is that it adds value to the process. So that's the first thing. And secondly, the Minister has just advertised the appeals convener's position, which tells me if you're going to appoint someone for 5 years, then you're not going to get rid of some of those appeals. So just watch that space and see what happens there. Okay, nature positive, how am I going?
No,
just
heaps of time.
Heaps of time. Okay, nature positive. Okay, now nature positive is a bit of a, I don't know why they called it nature positive, because it involves two parts. The actual nature positive is about a nature repair market. This is where there'll be a market where you can, if you're a landowner, for example, you can restore your land and create nature and trade that on the market. That's what it's about. And so that's the idea of nature positive. It is a business response to restoration. If you think about what WA's native vegetation policy is, hidden in it somewhere is a statement which says the aim of the native vegetation policy is a net gain in vegetation. So it's there. And the only way you're going to get a net gain is through offsetting and restoration. Same at the Commonwealth level. They're aiming for a net gain in vegetation. And that means not just offsetting, but restoration outside of offsetting as well. So that's likely to happen. How this market, the legislation's already been passed for the nature repair market. It's in place. That's only part of it. But really, the most important part, I suppose, for most people is the reforms to the EPBC Act and what's happening there. The legislation that's been introduced includes things like regional planning as well. So this is what nature positive is supposed to be about. You have a decline, you set a target for when you're going to stop the decline, and then you have a target for restoration for that. That's what is happening globally, and it will be interesting to see whether the government adopts a target approach. We don't know yet what they're going to do. And the other question, of course, is will it only be for matters of national environmental significance, or will it be for all vegetation? We don't know yet. It's kind of, you have to get the states on board if you want to do the latter. So the repair market, they put out 7.7 million for people to basically bid for restoration. It'll fund projects to restore and protect the environment. You must demonstrate improved biodiversity outcomes. They haven't yet developed the methods and the rules for that. And it should lead, they hope, to tradable markets in biodiversity. Now, this is not offsetting, okay? This is different from offsetting for that. Again, the question is whether it's MNES only. So some of the reforms then that we know of and likely to get through Parliament is a new EPA, funded for the tune of $121 million. It will administer the national law, issue permits and licences, project assessment decisions and post approvals, Regulation including compliance, yet to be introduced into Parliament. But the key question, if you look at that, what's the role of the minister? This is setting up the EPA to be a decision maker, which is different from WA, which is the EPA advises the minister and the minister decides. So that's setting up the EPA to be a decision maker, and rather than the minister. I suspect the minister may deal with appeals, but we don't know yet on that. At this stage, there are no standards being set. They're promising standards for all matters of national environmental significance, but the negotiations over standards are bogged down. And I belong to EIA and Z, and we've been negotiating with the Commonwealth about what the standards are going to be, and the discussions are problematic, to put it mildly. And we'll probably end up with very lukewarm standards, which won't be very helpful to anyone. And that's going to be the problem for that. We shall see. Regional planning, they're committed to doing regional planning. So it's not strategic environmental assessment. This is actually pre-assessment type regional planning. They want to provide clear information to decision makers. So they're going to fund regional planning to come up with environmental information. Set the regional rules for assessment. So you know beforehand, if you're working in an area which has been regionally planned, what are the rules that you're dealing with? It should inform in government and proponents. It will deal with cumulative impacts, and there will be links to environmental standards in that as well. And there's $29.3 million to start work on that. And again, the question we're all asking is it only about MNES? What about state stuff? You might be able to deal with state MNES, okay, but you may not deal with the state things. And therefore, you might be okay in the Commonwealth, you're still going to get an EPA assessment because you're not dealing with the state issues with regional planning. So we don't know yet in that regard. Okay, offsets. Offsets are moving, and significantly. Primarily up until recently, offsets was about acquisition. By that I mean, if you're clearing land, say if you're clearing 100 hectares, you would be required to purchase land from someone like for like. So Banksia Woodland here, I'm going to purchase Banksia Woodland over here, and I'm going to secure that in a conservation estate or a conservation covenant, something like that. That was the idea. And there's a multiplier ratio. If you're clearing 100, you're probably going to have to acquire 200 to 300 hectares. That's been traditionally what it's been the case. Now, those of you who work on the Swan Coastal Plain will know that pretty much all those acquisition areas have now been bought, and it's bloody expensive now to buy land. So that's been part of the problem. We're now moving a lot more to restoration. So what we're seeing from the Commonwealth is a shift from like-for-like to acquisition to like-for-like restoration. What does that actually mean? They're saying that if you're going to clear 100 hectares, don't bother telling me you're going to purchase 200 hectares of pristine Banksia woodland. That's not additionality. They're talking about additionality. That's not additionality. You're going to have to purchase 300 hectares of degraded Banksia woodland and restore that. So that's what they're talking about at Commonwealth level. So if you're talking to the Commonwealth now, that's what you're going to get back from them. Don't bother about pristine for pristine. It's going to be restoration is what it is. So you must demonstrate additionality. So no more of that. Now the EPA just recently has released, if you've missed it, this is the consideration of offsets at a regional scale. Now you probably, those of you who've dealt with the EPA, you know that pretty much your offsets are local ones. So you're looking at really like for like, near where your mine is going to be and you're clearing it to take place. They're saying now you can opt into this regional approach. So it's an opt-in only. And I would encourage you to really consider this, and because I think it's a very useful thing. So it doesn't replace existing policy, because the EPA is concerned that by conserving at a local level, we're doing regional destruction. So they want to see a regional approach to offset, which I think is a very positive thing to see happen. There are guiding principles for proponents to opt in. Restoration, number one. Regional scale management. What that means is that you're looking at, rather than just local management, looking at doing things at a regional level. So working at a number of sites maybe to deal with that. Building resilient systems, that's that restoration part of it. Expanding scientific knowledge. So as well as restoring, you'll be encouraged to actually do research into restoration. The problem with restoration is that everyone thinks it doesn't work. And and we struggle with it. And really, the success rate of restoration varies between 33% and around about 65%. That's about the success rate. And because of climate change, you're probably not going to get like for like. You might clear Bankshire woodland here, which has been there for a long time. You're restoring it over here. It's likely not to be like for like as well. So that's been one of the problems. So we want to understand more about the scientific knowledge of restoration. Like for like or similar. So there's the extra word now has got in there. They're looking for connectedness. So, for example, rather than necessarily looking at a place nearby, if you've got a nature reserve over here somewhere, then look at restoring land adjacent to that, which connects that nature reserve to a national park, but you're way over here. Okay, so it's looking at those connection things to improve biodiversity outcomes, and also co-benefits for social surroundings. And that primarily is going to be working with traditional owners and the ranger groups as well, and but not necessarily just them, local conservation groups. For example, working with TOs, which I do out in the Great Victoria Desert, doing cultural burning, okay, trying to get away from hot burns and doing their normal cultural burns, which has the benefit of improving biodiversity, but also locking carbon in. Rather than having hot burns, which kills everything, and gets rid of a whole pile of carbon into the atmosphere, the cooler burns they do as a cultural burn is better for carbon dioxide in that regard. So they then make recommendations for government. This is for government. Land availability and security. So that's a suggestion to government. You need to come up with sites which you think are useful for offsetting, which you may want restored. So give industry some guidance in that regard. Regional plans and recovery plans. So working with NRN groups in particular, but also local governments in the regions to come up with plans that they're thinking about restoration for. Monitoring transparency is going to be vital, particularly with a restoration. So reporting on how you're going over the long term. We're talking 30 to 40 years here that you're going to be reporting on your restoration. So it's a long-term commitment to that. Not just hand over to DBCA to manage. If you're in this for the long haul. Holistic values mapping. I struggle to understand what EPA talks about with holistic, but there you go. Definitely research programs and advanced offsets, which includes, for example, doing lots of research and those kind of things on specific species. And they want to understand, government to understand what's their role in delivering the outcomes. And it raises the question, will we actually start to see a government agency responsible now for this kind of approach, which I think is where we're trying to go. As you know, at the moment, the only people responsible for offsetting is DBCA if they get the land, but no one else actually monitors all the other offsets that are out there. So maybe we're going to see that occur. So this is the first example. If you want to see what it looks like, this is the example, which is the Metcalfe Vanadium project. It's an example of them applying the EPA's guidance on regional offsets. So have a look at that if you want to see what it is. And their offset is about connecting a nature reserve, which is down here, to another area. That's their mining area here. So it's connection or expanding the size of the nature reserve in effect. How many? 5. Good. Things to watch. It's my last bit for you to have a think about. Okay, EPA holistic assessments. Now, you get your head around this, what it actually means when they do an assessment. Okay, what they say is it's a reassessment of each factor. So you look at flora and fauna, you look at air quality, then they go back and reassess flora and fauna and say, does the loss of that vegetation, does it impact on other factors which we haven't already considered? So it certainly will impact on fauna. We know that. So I've done the fauna impact. I go back to the flora factor and say, does this have greater impacts than what we've assessed about fauna? That's what they're supposed to be looking at. Can I say it's an evolving thing? But it's something they're very keen on, and you've got to watch that space and see where it goes. So that's what I said then. So it's about non-identified impacts that haven't been already assessed by the EPA. And it will evolve as well. And my last thing to watch is environment and human rights. You need to watch the courts, is what I'm suggesting to you, and where they're going with this and what does it mean. So this is the Queensland Waratah mine. The Land Court recommended that the mining lease and the Environmental Authority of the Waratah mine be refused. Okay, so it was approved, it got taken to the court, and they refused it based on the following factors. Uncertainty on a nature reserve impact, climate change impacts, including Scope 3. We don't do Scope 3 here. Human rights impacts, and they have a Queensland Human Rights Act. So we don't have it here, but I still think there's cautions for us here. So they looked at the human right impacts: right to life, cultural rights of First Nations people, rights of children, property rights, the right to privacy and home, and the right to enjoy human rights equally. And the interesting one and the big one is the rights of children. Now, why I emphasise that, even though we haven't got a Human Rights Act, what we do have in the EP Act is that. There's a principle of the Act, I think it's the third one. The present generation should ensure that the health, diversity and productivity of the environment is maintained or enhanced for the benefit of future generations. Now, if you reflect on that, that means that the EPA should be assessing the impact of your proposal on future generations, on environmental matters, not on economic and social matters. Watch that in the courts is what I'm saying to you. EPA doesn't really deal with that very well, but my suspicion is that we're going to see more and more cases now of these happening, and that may be one of the things we look at. So keep an eye on that. And find this, the final word, before I wrap up, is I do run the following courses. I run a 2-day course for these guys on the environmental essentials. So I go through all the environmental stuff, including impact assessment, all the other parts of the Act as well. 2-day course. I promise you won't be bored, and after 2 days. And I also run 1-day courses just on impact assessment as well. Those who might be interested. So there, I finished early, I hope. I've got time for questions.